In the Lone Star Honky Tonk, a rising wrestling icon was about to cross a line he could never uncross. A Friday night crowd, drunk on whiskey and adrenaline, turned silent when Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson smashed a beer bottle over the head of a man who didn't flinch. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical bar patron. For decades, he was a world karate champion and screen warrior, known for training with Bruce Lee and dismantling opponents with surgical precision. When The Rock mistook silence for weakness and arrogance for dominance, he had no idea he was stepping into the presence of a man who'd built a lifetime on discipline. Chuck's calm response triggered a chain of consequences no body slam could contain. What began as a bar stunt for laughs would become a lesson in humility and respect. The Lone Star Honky Tonk would never be the same after the night. The Rock discovered that real strength isn't in domination, it's in silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The neon sign of the Lone Star Honky Tonk flickered against the Texas night, casting electric blue shadows across the dirt parking lot packed with trucks and motorcycles. Inside, the wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of boots stomping in rhythm to a live band's fiddle-heavy rendition of "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." The air hung thick with cigarette smoke, perfume, and the sweet tang of whiskey. Rosie Ironhand McGraw leaned against the bar counter, surveying her kingdom with the sharp eyes of a woman who'd seen it all. Her weathered hands, strong from years on the rodeo circuit before buying this place, mechanically wiped glasses as she kept watch over the Friday night crowd. "Gonna be wild tonight," she muttered to herself, nodding toward the door where a stream of excited rodeo fans poured in. Fresh from the arena down the road, she could smell the adrenaline on them, mixed with dust and excitement. Rodeo nights always brought the rowdiest crowds and the best tips. Near the jukebox, Slim the Mouth McCoy held court, his lanky frame draped against the wall, cowboy hat tipped back, and mouth running faster than a spooked Mustang. Every regular knew Slim had never been in a real fight himself, but he sure loved starting them. "I'm tellin' ya," Slim drawled to anyone who'd listen. "That new wrestler they call The Rock is something else. Saw him on TV last night. Picked up a man twice his size and threw him like a hay bale." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the door swung open, and the entire bar seemed to inhale collectively. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson stood in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the parking lot lights. Fresh off a WWF event in Dallas, the rising wrestling star carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. His black shirt strained against shoulders built for spectacle, and his smile, that million-dollar smile, flashed white in the dim bar light. "Well, I'll be damned," Rosie whispered, recognizing him immediately. Wrestling wasn't her thing, but even she knew who The Rock was becoming. The people's champion. The next big thing. The band faltered for just a moment before launching into something with more bass, more energy. The Rock strode in like he owned the place, nodding at the sea of faces turning his way. He wasn't just walking, he was performing, each step calculated to maximize presence. "Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity," Slim shouted, pushing off from the wall and raising his beer high. "The people's champion himself!" A cheer erupted, and The Rock played to it, raising his arms in that signature pose. "Finally," he called out, voice carrying effortlessly over the music. "The Rock has come back to Texas." The crowd ate it up. Men raised their beers, women pushed closer. The momentum of attention followed him like a wave as he made his way to the bar, slapping backs and shaking hands, pausing to flex for a photo with two women in matching cowboy hats. Rosie met his eye as he reached the counter. "What can I get you, champ?" Tequila, the Rock replied, leaning one elbow on the bar. The good stuff. And one for yourself. She poured the drinks, sliding one across to him. On the house. Not every day we get someone like you in here. The Rock raised his glass in thanks, then turned to face the room, basking in the attention. This was his element, the energy, the admiration, the eyes following his every move. What the Rock failed to notice, however, was the quiet figure in the corner booth. Sitting alone with a single glass of water was a man in a simple black shirt and jeans. Nothing about him commanded attention, and yet there was something in the way he held himself, something in his stillness, that suggested he didn't need to try. Chuck Norris sipped his water and observed, content to remain unnoticed. The martial arts legend hadn't come for attention, just a quiet drink after a long day at his nearby ranch. But his eyes, sharp and assessing, tracked the young wrestler's performance with quiet interest. As the night wore on, the Rock's presence transformed the bar. What had been a lively honky-tonk became his personal stage. He bought rounds for strangers, told road stories that had people doubling over with laughter, and demonstrated wrestling holds on willing volunteers who staggered away with dazed grins, honored to have been manhandled by the rising star. "Show us that thing you do," someone shouted. "That eyebrow thing." The Rock obliged, arching a single eyebrow in that famous expression, sending the crowd into fits of appreciation. He was magnetic, and he knew it. Each reaction fed him, pushing him to be more outrageous, more captivating. "If you smell," he started, and the entire bar joined in. "What the Rock is cookin'." The responding roar nearly shook the peanut shells from the floor. The Rock fed off it, growing larger, louder, more confident with each passing minute. Slim sidled up beside him, already 3 beers deep and loving the chaos he could create by association. "These folks don't get many real celebrities," he said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Bet none of these cowboys could last 10 seconds with you in the ring." The Rock chuckled, enjoying the flattery. "The Rock doesn't waste his time with jabronis," he said, voice pitched to carry to the surrounding tables. "Ain't nobody here brave enough to challenge you anyway," Slim continued, eyes darting around the room, looking for marks. "Though I bet some think they're tough just 'cause they ride bulls or—" His roving gaze stopped suddenly, fixed on the corner booth. A slow, troublemaking grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be. If that ain't Chuck Norris himself sittin' over there." The Rock followed Slim's gaze, squinting through the smoky air to the corner. For the first time that night, his performance faltered slightly. He knew that name, that face. Who didn't? The martial arts legend, the man whose reputation had spawned 1,000 jokes about superhuman toughness. But he wasn't here as a fan. He was just sitting there, watching, not participating in the Rock's moment. Something in that quiet observation needled at the Rock's sense of dominance. "Chuck Norris." "Huh?" the Rock said, voice deliberately loud enough to carry. He looked around, expecting the crowd's attention to shift, but most hadn't noticed Slim's observation. Slim nodded, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Yep. Mr. Walker. Texas Ranger himself. Comes in sometimes. Keeps to himself mostly." The Rock studied Chuck from across the room. The man was probably twice his age, but sat with the ease of someone comfortable in his skin. No entourage. No fanfare. Just quiet confidence that didn't demand validation. Something uncomfortable stirred in the Rock's chest, a feeling he wasn't accustomed to and didn't welcome. Was it respect? Uncertainty? Whatever it was, it chafed against his need to be the undisputed center of attention. The people's champion and the karate man, Slim mused, not realizing the dangerous territory he was entering. Wonder who'd win in a real fight? The question hung in the air, settling into the Rock's mind like a challenge. He was used to being the biggest name in any room, used to admiration without question. Chuck's quiet presence felt like an unspoken challenge to his status. Rosie, wiping down the bar nearby, caught the shift in the Rock's expression and felt a prickle of unease. She'd tended bar long enough to recognize when male ego was about to create problems. "Mr. Johnson," she said carefully, "can I get you another drink?" But the Rock was already straightening up, adjusting his posture to appear even larger. The alcohol, the crowd's energy, and his own need for dominance were creating a perfect storm of bad judgment. "You know what?" he said, voice rising again to performance level. "The Rock thinks it's time to meet a legend." Rosie opened her mouth to intervene, but Slim was already egging him on. "Hell yeah! 2 legends in one bar. What are the odds?" The Rock grabbed a fresh beer bottle from the counter and began making his way through the crowd, which parted before him like the Red Sea. His walk had changed, no longer the easy swagger of before, but something more deliberate, more charged. As he approached Chuck's table, conversations around them began to dim. The band played on, but heads were turning, attention shifting, as if the air itself could sense the impending collision of 2 powerful forces. Chuck looked up calmly as the Rock's shadow fell across his table. Their eyes met the Rock's, blazing with youthful fire and bravado, Chuck's steady and unreadable. "Chuck Norris," the Rock said, his voice carrying that practiced theatrical quality that served him so well in the ring. "The legend himself." Chuck nodded once, polite but reserved. "Mr. Johnson." The acknowledgement was respectful but not fawning, and somehow that made it worse. The Rock felt the balance of power slipping. This close, Chuck's composure was even more evident. He didn't fidget, didn't posture. He simply existed, secure, in himself. Conversations nearby had completely stopped now, people openly watching. The Rock was acutely aware of the audience. He'd come too far to walk away with a simple greeting. Something needed to happen. Something the crowd would talk about tomorrow. Something that reasserted his position at the top of the food chain. A smile spread across the Rock's face, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "The Rock thinks it's an honor to meet a man like you," he said, raising his beer bottle slightly. "A real legend." And, in that moment, as the last word left his mouth, a terrible idea crystallized in his mind. Fueled by ego, alcohol, and Slim's goading, the Rock made a decision that would change the course of the night. Before anyone could react, he brought the beer bottle down hard against Chuck Norris's head. The sound of glass striking skull echoed through the suddenly silent bar. The crash of breaking glass against Chuck Norris's head reverberated through the honky-tonk like a gunshot. Beer foamed down the martial artist's face and soaked into his simple black shirt. The moment hung suspended, a photograph of poor judgment frozen in time. The Rock stood with the broken bottleneck still clutched in his hand, his smile faltering as reality caught up with his impulse. He'd expected laughter, a viral moment that would cement his reputation as the bigger personality. Instead, he faced a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very air from the room. In that silence, Chuck Norris didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't even blink, as beer dripped from his hair onto the table. The band stumbled to an awkward halt, instruments trailing off note by discordant note. The bartender's hand froze mid-pour, whiskey overflowing the glass onto the countertop. Someone's pool cue clattered to the floor, the sound startling in the hush. Chuck reached up slowly, deliberately, and wiped a trickle of beer from his forehead with 2 fingers. His eyes never left the Rock's, and in them was neither anger nor fear, only a calm assessment that somehow felt more threatening than rage. "Shit," Rosie whispered from behind the bar, her voice carrying in the silence. She'd seen plenty of bar fights in her day, but this was different. This was a storm gathering, tension coiling like a rattlesnake before it strikes. The Rock's cocksure grin flickered and died. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He'd miscalculated. And he knew it instantly. The prank, that should have brought howls of laughter and cemented his alpha status, had instead sucked all the oxygen from the room. Worse, Chuck Norris remained completely unshaken, his composure unruffled by what should have been a humiliating assault. "Just a joke, man," The Rock said, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. He forced a laugh, looking around for support from the crowd, but found only wide eyes and stunned expressions. Slim, who moments before had been egging him on, had melted back into the crowd, suddenly fascinated by the label on his beer bottle. Chuck Norris said nothing. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then, with deliberate slowness, Chuck stood. He wasn't a large man, certainly not compared to The Rock's imposing physique, but as he rose, he seemed to fill more space than his frame should allow. There was a density to his presence, a focused gravity that made The Rock instinctively take half a step back. "Do you know what you just did?" Chuck asked. His voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the silent bar. There was no anger in it, which somehow made it worse. The Rock, accustomed to dominating any exchange, found himself fumbling for words. "Look, man, it was just—" "You don't," Chuck continued, as if The Rock hadn't spoken. "But you're about to find out." A man at a nearby table, grizzled, with the leathery face of a long-time rancher, leaned toward his companion. "That boy just made the biggest mistake of his life," he murmured, not bothering to lower his voice. The words carried to The Rock. And for the first time that night, a trickle of genuine unease worked its way down his spine. The atmosphere had changed in a way he couldn't quite grasp. The crowd that had been eating from his hand minutes ago now regarded him with something like pity. From the edge of the crowd, a voice called out, "That's Chuck Norris, you idiot." The Rock knew the name, of course. Everyone did. But standing here now, he realized he'd understood nothing about the man behind it. The Chuck Norris jokes. The TV show, they were just the surface. The reality was this unshakable presence before him, this calm that felt more dangerous than any shouted threat. Rosie emerged from behind the bar, moving with the caution of someone approaching a live wire. "Gentlemen," she said, "let's take this down a notch." Chuck glanced at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "No need for concern, Rosie." His gaze returned to The Rock. "Mr. Johnson was just leaving." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with such quiet certainty that for a moment, The Rock almost turned to go. Then his pride kicked in, bristling at being dismissed. "The Rock doesn't take orders," he said, finding his persona again, pushing past the discomfort. "The Rock gives them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back let out a nervous laugh that died quickly. "Is that right?" Chuck asked. The question gentle, but weighted with something indefinable. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. The Rock was suddenly aware of how many people were watching, recording this moment in their memories. How it would spread. How it would be told and retold. His reputation, so carefully constructed, hung in the balance. "Damn straight," he said, doubling down. "The people's champion doesn't back down from anyone." Chuck regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for a napkin from the table and calmly wiped the remaining beer from his face. "Your championship," he said quietly, "is in a ring with predetermined outcomes. Mine was earned in blood and discipline over decades. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The words landed like precision strikes. The Rock felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He was being diminished. His achievements dismissed as mere theater. And worse, in front of a crowd that had been chanting his name minutes earlier. "Listen, old man," he started, taking a step forward. Chuck didn't move, didn't shift his stance, didn't raise his hands. He simply looked at the Rock with those steady eyes, and somehow, that was enough to halt the larger man's advance. Around them, the atmosphere had changed again. The fear of violence remained. But there was something else, now: anticipation. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were choosing sides. And the Rock, with his sinking heart, could feel the tide turning against him. Slim, ever the opportunist, sensed the shift and moved with it. "Hey, Chuck," he called out, sidling back into view. "Don't let this jabroni push you around." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd at Slim's use of the Rock's own catchphrase against him. The betrayal stung more than the Rock wanted to admit. "That's enough," Rosie said, her voice sharp with authority. She moved between the two men, though she had to crane her neck to look the Rock in the eye. "I don't care who either of you are. This is my establishment, and I won't have it torn apart for your egos." The Rock glanced around, suddenly aware of how the situation was slipping away from him. The script had gone wrong. In the wrestling ring, everything was choreographed: the villain, the hero, the moves, the outcome. But this was real life, and he was losing control of the narrative. "The young man meant no harm," Chuck said to Rosie, though his eyes remained fixed on the Rock. "He's just never learned the difference between attention and respect." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. The Rock felt exposed, as if Chuck had reached inside him and pulled out an insecurity he'd buried beneath layers of bravado and catchphrases. "You think you know me?" The Rock demanded, his voice rising. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Chuck replied simply. "I know you're strong, but untested. I know you've confused admiration with achievement. And I know that, until tonight, no one has ever shown you the difference." The bar had gone so quiet that the sound of ice melting in drinks seemed loud. Everyone was watching, witnessing this dismantling of a persona built on dominance and theatrics. "Tell you what," the Rock said, fighting to regain his footing in the exchange. "Why don't we take this outside? No cameras, no referees, just you and me." He spread his arms wide, inviting challenge. "Then we'll see who's tested." A ripple went through the crowd, half excitement, half disbelief. Was this really happening? The Rock versus Chuck Norris in the parking lot of a Texas honky-tonk? Chuck's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but something akin to disappointment. "Violence as spectacle," he said quietly. "That's the only language you know." Before the Rock could respond, Rosie stepped forward again, her patience visibly fraying. "That's it. Both of you. Outside. Not to fight," she added sharply, "but to cool off. I've got a business to run, and this standoff is costing me money by the second." She turned to Chuck first, showing a deference that further irked the Rock. "Mr. Norris, I apologize for the disturbance. Your next drink is on the house, if you choose to stay." Then she rounded on the Rock, her earlier hospitality evaporated. "As for you, Mr. Johnson, I think you've had enough excitement for one night." The Rock bristled, unaccustomed to being dismissed. The Rock decides when he's had enough. "Not in my bar, you don't," Rosie countered, undaunted by his size. "Out. Now, or I call the sheriff." The mention of law enforcement shifted the calculus. The last thing The Rock needed was headlines about being arrested in a bar fight. His career was taking off. Sponsors were circling. He couldn't afford that kind of publicity. But he also couldn't simply back down. Not with so many witnesses. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Fine," he said, affecting nonchalance. "The Rock has better places to be anyway." He turned to leave, then paused, unable to resist one final attempt to save face. He looked back at Chuck, who remained unmoved by the entire exchange. "This isn't over," The Rock said, trying to inject menace into his voice. Chuck regarded him steadily. "It was over before it began," he replied softly. "You just don't know it yet." A few people in the crowd made sounds, oohs and whispers. Someone near the back actually applauded. The Rock felt his face burn. He turned and pushed his way through the crowd, which no longer parted easily before him. People stood their ground, making him navigate around them, small resistances that spoke volumes. As he reached the door, he heard Slim's voice carry across the bar. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The chant was picked up by others, growing in volume. Chuck's name filled the space that minutes ago had echoed with The Rock's catchphrases. The Rock paused at the door, hand on the frame, the night air cool against his flushed skin. He didn't look back. Couldn't bear to see the scene he'd left behind his audience. His moment, claimed by a man who hadn't raised his voice or lifted a finger. He stepped into the night, the door swinging shut behind him, cutting off the chance. In the sudden quiet of the parking lot, with only the distant sounds of highway traffic and the muffled thump of the bar's music, reality settled over him like a cold blanket. For the first time in his meteoric rise to fame, The Rock felt small. The parking lot of the Lone Star Honky Tonk stretched out before The Rock, bathed in the neon glow of the bar's sign. His breath came in short, angry bursts, condensing in the cool night air. Behind him, through the closed door, the muffled sounds of the bar continued, music resuming, voices rising, life going on without him at its center. He paced between the rows of pickup trucks, unable to simply leave, too proud to go back inside. His mind raced, replaying the confrontation, searching for the moment it had all gone wrong. How had he lost control so completely? He was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the people's champion, the most electrifying man in sports entertainment. He didn't get dismissed. He didn't get sent away like some drunk nobody. And yet, here he was, exiled to the parking lot while Chuck Norris remained inside, unruffled, unchanged by the encounter that had left The Rock's carefully constructed image in tatters. The door to the bar swung open, spilling light and music briefly into the night before closing again. The Rock turned, half hoping to see a group of fans coming to show support, to reassure him that he was still their champion. Instead, he saw Rosie, her arms crossed, regarding him with a mixture of wariness and something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "You're still here," she observed, walking toward him with the confident stride of a woman who'd spent years breaking up fights between men twice her size. "The Rock doesn't run away," he replied automatically, falling back on the safety of his persona. Rosie sighed, reaching into her pocket for a pack of cigarettes. She lit one, the flame briefly illuminating her weathered face. "You might want to drop the third-person act, son. It doesn't play so well out here in the real world." The Rock bristled. "Listen, lady." "No, you listen." Rosie cut him off, blowing smoke into the night air. "I've been running this bar for 15 years. Before that, I rode the rodeo circuit for a decade. I've seen every kind of ego, every flavor of tough guy there is." She took another drag from her cigarette. "You know what they all have in common? They're all just scared little boys underneath." The Rock clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to storm off. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Rosie raised an eyebrow. You walk into my bar like you own the place. Fine. You buy drinks, tell stories, put on a show. Also fine. But then you spot someone who isn't impressed by your act. And suddenly, you've got something to prove. She shook her head. Tale as old as time. The Rock wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. There was an uncomfortable ring of truth to what she was saying. Do you even know who that man is? Rosie continued, gesturing back toward the bar with her cigarette. Really no? Chuck Norris, The Rock said dismissively. Action star, karate guy. I know who he is. Rosie laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. You don't know the half of it. That karate guy revolutionized martial arts in this country. 6-time world karate champion. Trained with Bruce Lee. Taught some of the toughest fighters in the world. She took another drag. But more than that, he's respected. Not because he talks big or puts on a show, but because he's earned it through decades of discipline and hard work. The Rock shifted uncomfortably. He knew Chuck's resume, of course, but hearing it laid out so plainly made his beer bottle stunt seem even more foolish. So what? He said, trying to maintain his defiance. I'm supposed to bow down just because he's been around longer? No, Rosie replied patiently. You're supposed to show respect because it's deserved. There's a difference between being seen and being respected, Johnson. One is about attention. The other is about character. The words hit home harder than The Rock wanted to admit. His entire career was built on being seen. The catchphrases, the eyebrow, the larger-than-life persona. But respect? That was more complicated. He embarrassed me, The Rock said finally, his voice lower, dropping some of the bluster. No, Rosie corrected. You embarrassed yourself. He just stood there. And that was the worst part, wasn't it? Chuck hadn't needed to do anything. He'd simply existed, and somehow that had been enough to dismantle The Rock's carefully constructed aura of dominance. Before The Rock could respond, the bar door opened again. This time, it was Slim, his lanky frame silhouetted against the light. Rock! Hey, Rock! He called, jogging over with the uneven gait of someone who'd had a few too many beers. Man! You gotta come back inside. It's wild in there. The Rock eyed him suspiciously. Thought you were Team Chuck now. Slim had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Hey, I go where the action is, you know that. He clapped The Rock on the shoulder, oblivious to the tension. But listen. This is your chance to make it right. Chuck's telling stories about his fighting days, and people are eating it up. If you went back in, apologized, maybe asked him to show you a move or two. He spread his hands wide. Instant redemption, man. The suggestion stung The Rock's pride like salt in a wound. Apologize? Ask for instruction? Like some novice? The very idea made him bristle. The Rock doesn't apologize, he said stiffly. Rosie sighed, flicking ash from her cigarette. And there's your problem. Too caught up in your own myth to see when you're wrong. I'm not wrong, The Rock insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He's just an old man trying to stay relevant. Slim's eyes widened at the comment, and he took a step back. Whoa, man. You really don't get it, do you? Get what? The Rock demanded. Chuck Norris doesn't try to be relevant, Slim said, shaking his head. He just is. Always has been, always will be. That's the difference between you two. Coming from Slim troublemaker, instigator, the man who'd encouraged him to approach Chuck in the first place. The observation cut deep. Rosie regarded The Rock thoughtfully. You've got a choice to make, son. You can walk away, nurse your wounded pride, and miss a chance to learn something valuable. Or you can go back in there, be a man, and maybe, just maybe, earn some actual respect. The Rock stood frozen, caught between his ego and the growing realization that he might have fundamentally misjudged the situation. Inside the bar, he could hear the crowd laughing, enjoying themselves. Without him, the sound grated against his need to be the center of attention. What's it gonna be? Rosie pressed. Pride or growth? The question hung in the air between them. The Rock looked from Rosie to Slim, then back to the bar door. Through the window, he could see people clustered around Chuck's table, listening raptly to whatever the martial artist was saying. Something shifted inside him, not a complete transformation, but a crack in the armor, a small voice questioning if maybe, just maybe, he'd been approaching this all wrong. Fine, he said finally, his voice gruff. The Rock will. He caught himself, noting Rosie's raised eyebrow. I'll go back in, but I'm not begging for forgiveness. Rosie stubbed out her cigarette. Nobody's asking you to beg. Just to recognize when you're in the presence of someone who's walked a longer, harder road than you have. The three of them moved toward the bar, Slim practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of more drama, Rosie watching The Rock carefully, and The Rock himself trying to sort through the tangle of emotions warring inside him. As they reached the door, Rosie put a hand on his arm, stopping him. One more thing, she said, her voice low but firm. You make another scene in my bar, and it doesn't matter how many catchphrases you have or how many tickets you sell, I'll throw you out myself. Clear? The Rock met her gaze, recognizing the steel behind her words. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, if not quite submission. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded back. All right then. Let's see if the people's champion can learn a thing or two about being a real champion. With that, she pushed open the door, and the sounds of the bar washed over them in a wave of music, laughter, and conversation. The Rock squared his shoulders, preparing to re-enter the scene of his humiliation. Unsure of what awaited him, but knowing that somehow, what happened next would define more than just this night. It would define who he was, beyond the ring, beyond the catchphrases, beyond the character he'd created. And deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged, he feared what that definition might reveal. As he stepped back into the light and noise of the honky-tonk, The Rock felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Uncertainty. Not about his physical abilities or his charisma, but about himself, who he was beneath the persona, beneath the muscles, and the smile, and the carefully crafted image. And in that moment of uncertainty, he was more real than he'd been all night. The moment The Rock re-entered the Lone Star honky-tonk, he sensed the shift. The energy had changed, the bar no longer revolved around his gravitational pull. Instead, all focus centered on the corner where Chuck Norris sat, surrounded by an attentive circle of patrons. The martial arts legend spoke softly, forcing people to lean in, commanding attention through restraint rather than volume. The Rock paused just inside the door, Rosie and Slim flanking him like cautious handlers. A few heads turned at his entrance, registering his return with varying degrees of interest before turning back to Chuck. The dismissal, however subtle, stung. Go on, Rosie murmured, giving him a gentle nudge forward. Don't just stand there like you're waiting for an introduction. The Rock straightened his shoulders and moved through the crowd with as much of his usual confidence as he could muster. It wasn't easy. Every step toward Chuck's table felt like walking uphill, his usual swagger hampered by the weight of his earlier misstep. As he approached, he caught fragments of Chuck's story, something about training with Bruce Lee in the 1,970 seconds. The circle of listeners laughed appreciatively at something Chuck said, their faces rapt with genuine interest. "Never saw anyone move that fast in my life," Chuck was saying, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who doesn't need to try to be heard. "Bruce could throw 5 punches before most men could throw one." "Could you take him in a real fight?" someone asked. Chuck smiled, a genuine expression that softened his face. "No one could. That's what made him Bruce Lee." The humility in the answer struck The Rock. Here was a legend in his own right, speaking with reverence about another fighter's abilities, comfortable enough in his own accomplishments to acknowledge superiority where it existed. The contrast with his own brash self-promotion was stark. The crowd around the table noticed The Rock's approach, and a ripple of awareness spread outward. Conversations faltered. Backs stiffened. The atmosphere grew charged once again, loaded with the potential energy of confrontation. Chuck looked up last, his eyes finding The Rock's with that same unnerving calm. He didn't seem surprised to see the wrestler return, nor did he show any lingering anger over the beer bottle incident. He simply waited, patient and composed. The crowd parted slightly, creating a path for The Rock to approach the table. The silence stretched, everyone watching, waiting for what would happen next in this unexpected drama unfolding in their local bar. The Rock cleared his throat. This wasn't a wrestling promo. This wasn't a scripted moment with predetermined outcomes. This was real life, with real consequences. And for once, he found himself without a rehearsed line. "Mr. Norris," he began, his voice lower and less theatrical than before. "Can I have a word?" Chuck studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Of course," he gestured to an empty chair at his table. "Have a seat." The invitation itself was a kindness The Rock knew he hadn't earned. He sat, aware of the dozens of eyes watching their interaction, the collective breath being held. Slim hovered nearby, practically vibrating with anticipation. "I'm listening," Chuck said simply, when The Rock didn't immediately speak. The Rock glanced around at the expectant faces, then back to Chuck. "I was thinking maybe we could talk. Privately?" A hint of amusement flickered in Chuck's eyes. "You didn't seem concerned about privacy when you broke a bottle over my head." Several onlookers sucked in their breath. The challenge was clear. Whatever The Rock had to say, he would say it here, in front of the same audience that had witnessed his mistake. The Rock's jaw tightened. Pride warred with the growing realization that he had seriously misjudged not just Chuck, but the entire situation. He'd walked into this bar expecting to be treated like a god, only to discover he was in the presence of someone who commanded a different, deeper kind of respect. The kind that couldn't be earned through catchphrases and flexing. "Fair enough," The Rock conceded. He leaned forward, forearms on the table, voice pitched just loud enough for those closest to hear. "Look, what I did. That wasn't cool. I got caught up in the moment." Chuck's expression remained neutral. "Is that an apology?" The question hung in the air. The Rock felt a bead of sweat trace down his spine. In the ring, his character never apologized. Weakness wasn't part of The Rock's brand, but sitting here, under Chuck's steady gaze, the artificial nature of that persona became glaringly apparent. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yes, it is. I'm sorry." The words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar territory. But as they left his lips, he felt something unexpected. Not the shame he'd feared, but a curious lightening, as if he'd set down a heavy weight he'd been carrying. Chuck nodded, accepting the apology without fanfare. "Thank you." He took a sip of his water. "Now, was there something you wanted to ask me?" The Rock blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. "Ask you?" "You didn't come back in here just to apologize," Chuck observed. Your pride wouldn't have allowed it without another purpose. His eyes held no judgment, only clarity. So what is it? Again, the Rock was struck by how easily this man saw through him. It was unnerving but also strangely compelling. No one in the wrestling business spoke to him with such straightforward insight. I guess I wanted to understand, The Rock said slowly, feeling his way through unfamiliar emotional territory. Everyone in this bar knows who you are, respects you. But you don't perform. You don't try to own the room. Chuck considered this. I did all my performing when I was younger, he said. In competitions, in films. I learned over time that the louder you have to announce yourself, the less you actually have to say. He studied The Rock. You're still at the stage where you believe your worth is measured by how many eyes are on you. The blunt assessment stung, but The Rock couldn't deny its accuracy. His entire career was built on commanding attention, being the most electrifying, the most charismatic, the most memorable person in any room. It's worked pretty well for me so far, he said, a hint of defensiveness creeping back into his tone. Has it? Chuck asked mildly. Or has it just made you dependent on the validation of strangers? The question landed like a body blow. Direct and painful. The Rock fought the instinct to deflect with humor or aggression, his usual tactics when feeling exposed. Around them, the bar patrons watched with fascination, witnessing something few had expected. The Rock, silent and thoughtful, absorbing criticism from a man who spoke without raising his voice. I've been fighting since before you were born, Chuck continued, his tone conversational rather than lecturing. Not just in the ring or on film, but the real fights, the ones against your own ego, your own limitations, those are the hardest ones to win. The Rock nodded slowly. And how do you win those? Chuck smiled slightly. You don't. Not completely. You just get better at recognizing when they're happening. He leaned back in his chair. Tonight, you lost a fight with your ego. It happens to everyone. The question is, what will you learn from it? Before The Rock could respond, Slim pushed forward, unable to contain himself any longer. Hey, this is all real deep and everything, he interjected. But the people want to know who would win in a real fight between you two. Several groans rose from the crowd. Rosie, who had been watching from nearby, rolled her eyes dramatically. The Rock tensed, expecting Chuck to take offense at the crass question after their moment of genuine connection. Instead, Chuck laughed a warm, genuine sound. Him, Chuck said, nodding at The Rock. Without question. The Rock stared at him in surprise. What? He's younger, stronger, at his physical peak. Chuck explained to the crowd. I'm in my 50s. Only a fool would bet against youth and power. The bar patrons murmured in surprise, many shaking their heads in disagreement. But, Chuck continued, raising a finger, winning a fight and winning respect are different achievements. He looked directly at The Rock. One lasts for a night. The other lasts a lifetime. The Rock felt something shift inside him. Not a complete transformation, but the seed of understanding, taking root. The distinction Chuck had just articulated was something he'd never fully considered, too caught up in the immediate gratification of adulation and dominance. So what you're saying, The Rock said slowly, is that I've been fighting the wrong battles. Chuck shrugged. I'm saying there are many kinds of strength. The kind that can break a beer bottle. He touched his head lightly where the glass had struck. And the kind that knows when not to. He held The Rock's gaze. Which do you think is harder to develop? The question wasn't rhetorical. It demanded an answer, and The Rock found himself considering it seriously, perhaps for the first time in his meteoric rise to fame. The second kind, he admitted finally. Chuck nodded, satisfied. That's a start. Around them, the atmosphere in the bar had transformed again. The tension of potential conflict had given way to something else, a collective witnessing of what felt like an important exchange between two generations of icons. Phones remained pocketed, no one wanting to cheapen the moment by recording it. "So what now?" The Rock asked, genuinely unsure of where to go from this point. Chuck smiled. "Now we have a drink. Like civilized men. And maybe," he added, "you tell me what it's like. Working with Vince McMahon. I've heard stories." Just like that, the formal tension dissolved. Chuck had offered not just forgiveness, but a path forward, a chance to connect as equals rather than as adversaries. Rosie appeared at the table, placing a fresh glass of water in front of Chuck and a beer in front of The Rock. "On the house," she said, her earlier sternness softened by the clear resolution of conflict. "For both of you." As she walked away, The Rock caught her subtle nod of approval. He'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "To lessons learned," Chuck said, raising his water glass in a toast. The Rock clinked his beer against it. "To the second kind of strength," he replied. And as the night continued, with stories exchanged and mutual respect growing, The Rock began to understand what Chuck had been trying to tell him all along. True strength wasn't about dominating a room, it was about being secure enough not to need to. It wasn't about being the loudest voice, but about having something worth saying when you spoke. It was a lesson that would stay with him long after the neon lights of the Lone Star honky-tonk faded into the Texas night, a lesson more valuable than any championship belt or catchphrase could ever be. The conversation between Chuck Norris and The Rock flowed more naturally than anyone in the Lone Star honky-tonk could have predicted an hour earlier. What had begun as a tense confrontation had transformed into something resembling mentorship. The seasoned warrior sharing insights with the young champion on the rise. The crowd around them had thinned somewhat, giving them space while remaining close enough to catch fragments of their exchange. Even Slim had eventually wandered off, disappointed by the lack of further drama, but satisfied to have witnessed the unexpected reconciliation. "So, there I was," Chuck was saying, his eyes crinkling with amusement as he recounted a story from his early tournament days, "flat on my back, looking up at the ceiling, wondering what had just happened. My opponent, a fifth-degree black belt from Korea, was already being declared the winner." The Rock leaned forward, genuinely invested in the story. "What did you do?" "I got up," Chuck said simply. "Bowed to him, congratulated him, and went back to training the next day. Trained twice as hard. Learned from the mistake." He took a sip of his water. "6 months later, we met in another tournament. This time, I was ready." "And you won?" The Rock prompted. Chuck smiled. "I did, but that's not the point of the story." "What is then?" "The point is that losing taught me more than winning ever could." Chuck studied The Rock's face. "Have you ever really lost, Johnson? Not a scripted match, but truly failed at something that mattered to you?" The question caught The Rock off guard. His instinct was to deflect, to maintain the image of invincibility he'd cultivated so carefully. But something in Chuck's steady gaze invited honesty. "My football career," he admitted after a moment. "I wanted the NFL. Ended up in the Canadian League. Then got cut. Came home with $7 in my pocket." He shook his head at the memory. "Failure doesn't begin to describe it." Chuck nodded, acknowledging the confession. "And yet here you are, becoming one of the biggest names in wrestling, because you didn't let that failure define you." "Had to reinvent myself," The Rock said. "Create a new path." "Exactly." Chuck leaned forward slightly. "Reinvention requires humility. The acknowledgement that the old way isn't working. Many men never learn that lesson. They keep hammering away at closed doors rather than looking for new openings. From behind the bar, Rosie watched their exchange with quiet satisfaction. The night had taken a turn none of them had expected. Least of all The Rock. What could have ended in violence or humiliation had instead become a moment of growth. At a nearby table, a group of rodeo cowboys who had been listening in on the conversation exchanged glances. One of them, emboldened by alcohol and the now relaxed atmosphere, approached the table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice respectful but eager. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan of both of you." He looked from Chuck to The Rock and back again. "Would you mind if I asked a question?" Chuck gestured to an empty chair. "Not at all. Have a seat." The cowboy sat, his weathered face breaking into a boyish grin. "I've always wondered how much of the wrestling is real. Like, the falls and the hits and all that." The Rock chuckled. "The falls are real. The concrete doesn't get any softer just because the outcome is predetermined." He rolled his shoulder. "An old injury making itself known. Everything hurts. We just make it look good." "And the rivalries," the cowboy pressed. "Are those real too?" The Rock glanced at Chuck, then back to the cowboy. "Some are, some aren't. The best ones. There's always a bit of truth in them. That's what makes them compelling." Chuck nodded in agreement. "Same in the film business. The best on-screen fights come from a place of mutual respect off-screen. You have to trust your opponent to make it look real without actually hurting you." The cowboy absorbed this, clearly delighted to be receiving insights from both men. "One more question, if that's all right." At their nods, he continued. "What's the hardest part of what you do?" The Rock considered this. "For me, it's the travel. The constant movement. Never really being home." He was surprised by his own honesty, by how easily the truth came in Chuck's presence. Everyone sees the glory, the big moments. They don't see the empty hotel rooms, the missed birthdays, the toll it takes. Chuck's expression softened with recognition. "The sacrifice," he agreed. "The things you give up to pursue greatness." He turned to the cowboy. "I imagine it's not so different in rodeo. The road, the risks, the distance from family." The cowboy nodded, surprised and pleased to be understood. "Yes, sir. That's exactly it." "Worth it, though?" The Rock asked, suddenly curious about this man's perspective. The cowboy thought for a moment. "Most days. Yeah. Some days." He shrugged. "Some days you wonder." The three men fell silent, united briefly by the unspoken understanding of what it meant to chase something bigger than ordinary life, and the costs that came with it. After the cowboy thanked them and returned to his friends, The Rock turned back to Chuck. "You make it look easy," he said. "What's that?" "Connecting with people. Really connecting. Not just playing to them." The Rock gestured around the bar. "I know how to work a crowd. But what you do, it's different." Chuck shook his head. "Not different. Just hard-earned. When I was your age, I was just as caught up in proving myself, making my mark." A smile touched his lips. "Age teaches you that connections outlast applause." Before The Rock could respond, the bar's front door burst open, and a group of young men spilled in, loud and already half-drunk. They wore matching shirts with a local college logo, their voices carrying across the room as they jostled and laughed. "Frat boys," Rosie muttered from behind the bar, her expression darkening. She moved out from behind the counter, clearly preparing to establish ground rules before things got out of hand. One of the young men, taller than the rest and with the confident swagger of a campus athlete, spotted the rock and did a comical double-take. "No way!" he exclaimed, loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Guys! Guys! It's the Rock!" He pointed directly at the wrestler, drawing the attention of his friends, who reacted with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Holy shit! The Rock! The people's champion! If ya smell what the Rock is cookin'!" They descended on the table like a wave, smartphones already out, jostling for position to take selfies. Their enthusiasm was genuine but unrestrained, fueled by alcohol and the unexpected celebrity sighting. The Rock shifted, his body language changing subtly as he slipped back into his public persona. The smile returned, the charisma switched on like a light. He was The Rock again, not Dwayne Johnson, who had been having a thoughtful conversation moments before. "Whoa! Whoa! Easy there, jabronis," he said, voice rising to his performance pitch. "The Rock appreciates the enthusiasm, but let's take it down a notch." The young men laughed, delighted to hear one of his catchphrases in person. They crowded closer, oblivious to the intrusion they represented. "Can we get a picture? Please? My brother is never going to believe this. Can you do the eyebrow thing? Just once?" Chuck observed silently, noting the transformation in The Rock with interest rather than judgment. This was the reality of modern fame: constant demands for performance, for access, for pieces of oneself given freely to strangers. Rosie pushed through the group, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Gentlemen," she said, the word carrying a clear warning, "you're welcome in my establishment, but not if you're going to behave like this. Back up, give them some space, or find somewhere else to drink tonight." The leader of the group, the tall athlete, turned to her with the dismissive confidence of youth. "Chill out, lady. We're just saying hi to The Rock." His eyes flicked to Chuck, not recognizing him, and his dad or whoever. A collective intake of breath swept through the nearby tables. Several patrons who had been watching the scene unfold exchanged glances of disbelief at the young man's ignorance. The Rock's easy smile faltered. He glanced at Chuck, expecting to see offense, but found only that same unflappable calm. If anything, there was a hint of amusement in the martial artist's eyes. "That's Chuck Norris," The Rock said, his voice deliberately level. "Show some respect." The young man blinked, processing this information through his alcohol-hazed mind. "Chuck. Wait, the meme guy? Walker, Texas Ranger?" He laughed, turning to his friends. "Guys, it's the Chuck Norris joke, dude." His friends' reactions were mixed. A couple joined in his laughter, but others looked uncertain, sensing they were crossing a line. "Man, I love those jokes," the leader continued, oblivious to the tension he was creating. "Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down." He laughed at his own recitation. Classic. The Rock felt something inside him shift, a protective instinct rising that surprised him with its intensity. An hour ago, he'd smashed a beer bottle over Chuck's head for attention. Now, he found himself bristling at this young man's casual disrespect. "That's enough," he said, his voice dropping to a register rarely heard in his wrestling promos. "You don't know who you're talking to." The young man's smile faltered, confusion replacing his bravado. "What? They're just jokes, man." Everyone loves Chuck Norris jokes. "The jokes," The Rock said carefully, "are not the man. And the man deserves your respect." Chuck placed a hand lightly on The Rock's arm. "It's all right," he said quietly. No offense taken. But The Rock wasn't ready to let it go. Something important was crystallizing within him, a lesson he'd been on the verge of understanding all night. No, "It's not all right," he said, rising to his full height, which put him eye to eye with the young athlete. "You want to know who Chuck Norris really is? He's a 6-time world karate champion. He trained with Bruce Lee. He's been standing up for what's right on and off screen since before you were born." The Rock's voice carried across the now silent bar. "And 10 minutes ago, he taught me more about real strength in a 5-minute conversation than I've learned in my entire career." The young man took an involuntary step back, sobering slightly under the Rock's intense gaze. "I walked into this bar tonight thinking I was the biggest thing in the room," the Rock continued, speaking not just to the fraternity boys now, but to everyone listening. "I was wrong, and if I can admit that, you sure as hell can show some basic respect." A long moment of silence followed his words. The young athlete looked from the Rock to Chuck, his expression shifting from confusion to embarrassment. I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled finally, addressing Chuck directly. "No disrespect intended." Chuck nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he'd accepted the Rock's earlier. "None taken. Enjoy your evening, gentlemen." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. The group retreated to the bar, subdued by the encounter. Around the room, approving glances were exchanged, and the Rock found himself on the receiving end of nods of respect from the same patrons who had witnessed his earlier foolishness. As he sat back down, he felt strangely self-conscious. "Sorry about that," he said to Chuck. "Didn't mean to make a scene." Chuck studied him with new interest. "Don't apologize for standing up for what's right." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Though I admit, it's an interesting reversal from earlier this evening." The Rock laughed, acknowledging the irony. "Yeah, well, sometimes it takes getting knocked down a peg to see things clearly." "That," Chuck said, raising his water glass slightly, "is the truest thing you've said all night." Rosie approached their table, a bottle in each hand. "Thought you gentlemen might appreciate a fresh round," she said, replacing their drinks. "On the house." As she turned to leave, she paused, looking back at the Rock. "Not bad," she said simply. "Not bad at all." The Rock felt an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol. The quiet satisfaction of having earned genuine respect. Not through catchphrases or physical dominance, but through doing the right thing when it mattered. He looked at Chuck across the table. This legend, who had somehow turned an act of disrespect into a lesson in humility and growth. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Chuck asked. "For not kicking my ass when you had every right to," the Rock replied, with a rueful smile. "And for showing me there's more than one way to be strong." Chuck nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. The journey never ends. Johnson. We're all works in progress, no matter how many championships we win or movies we make. As the night deepened around them, the two men continued their conversation no longer as adversaries or even as legend and student, but as two travelers on the same road, sharing what they'd learned along the way. And around them, the Lone Star honky-tonk hummed with life, a witness to the quiet transformation taking place in its midst the night. The Rock learned that true strength often speaks in whispers, not shouts, and that the most important victories are won not in the ring, but in the heart. Dawn crept across the Texas landscape, painting the eastern sky in watercolor hues of amber and gold. The Lone Star honky-tonk stood quiet now, its neon signs dark. The parking lot nearly empty save for a few scattered vehicles belonging to the last stragglers and Rosie's old pickup truck. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from the electric energy of hours before to the intimate quiet of a night winding down. The band had packed up long ago, replaced by the soft crackle of country ballads from the vintage jukebox in the corner. The dance floor, that had vibrated with stomping boots, was now empty, littered with peanut shells and memories of the evening's drama. At a corner table, Chuck Norris and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson sat across from each other, 2 empty glasses and a half-finished bottle of water between them. Their unlikely conversation had stretched through the small hours, evolving from tense confrontation to something neither man had anticipated: genuine connection. "So, there I was," Chuck was saying, his voice low and measured, "flat on my back in Seoul, looking up at the ceiling lights, wondering what had just happened. My opponent, a 5th-degree black belt, was already being declared the winner." The Rock leaned forward, engrossed in the story. Gone was the theatrical persona, the raised eyebrow, the third-person declarations. In their place sat Dwayne, attentive and thoughtful. "What did you do?" "I got up," Chuck said simply, thanked him for the lesson, bowed, and went back to training the next day. Twice as hard. He traced a pattern in the condensation on the table. 6 months later, we met again in competition. "And you won?" Dwayne asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Chuck nodded. "I did. But that's not why I'm telling you this story." "Then why are you?" "Because losing taught me more than winning ever could," Chuck said, his eyes finding Dwayne's with that same steady gaze that had unsettled him hours before. "Have you ever truly lost, Johnson? Not a scripted match, but failed at something that mattered deeply to you?" The question caught Dwayne off guard. His instinct was to deflect, to maintain the image of invincibility he'd so carefully cultivated. But something in Chuck's presence invited honesty. "Football," he admitted after a moment's hesitation. "I wanted the NFL. Got cut from the Canadian League instead. Came home with $7 in my pocket." He shook his head at the memory. "Failure doesn't begin to describe it." Chuck nodded, acknowledging the confession. "And yet, here you are, becoming one of the biggest names in wrestling, because you didn't let that failure define you." "Had to reinvent myself," Dwayne said, surprising himself with the candidness in his voice. "Create a new path." "Exactly." Chuck leaned forward slightly. "Reinvention requires humility, acknowledging that the old way isn't working. Many men never learn that lesson. They keep hammering away at closed doors rather than looking for new openings." From behind the bar, Rosie watched their exchange, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth as she wiped down the counter for the night. The transformation she'd witnessed in the younger man over the course of a few hours was remarkable, from the swaggering showman who'd entered her establishment to this more thoughtful version, absorbing wisdom with genuine hunger. Rosie approached their table, coffee pot in hand. "Last call, gentlemen. Can I top you off before I shut down the kitchen?" Chuck shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you, Rosie." Dwayne hesitated, then pushed his cup forward. "I'll take a refill. Thanks." As she poured, Rosie studied him with those shrewd eyes that seemed to see more than most. "You know," she said conversationally. "Been running this place 15 years, seen all kinds walk through that door. But I don't think I've ever seen anyone change course quite as fast as you did tonight." Dwayne accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, feeling the weight of her assessment. "That obvious, huh? To someone who's been watching people as long as I have?" "Yeah, pretty obvious." Her expression softened slightly. "But for what it's worth, I liked what I saw tonight after the beer bottle incident, I mean." The reminder of his earlier behavior sent a flush of embarrassment through Dwayne, but he met her gaze directly. "Thanks, Rosie." She turned to Chuck with a respectful nod. "Always good to see you, Mr. Norris. Your usual table's always open when you want it." As Rosie moved away to continue closing preparations, Dwayne found himself reflecting on the strange journey of the night, how he'd walked in as the Rock, larger than life, seeking adulation, and now sat here as something more complex, more vulnerable. "Can I ask you something?" he said to Chuck after a moment's silence. Chuck gestured for him to continue. "How do you balance it? The public persona and the private person?" Dwayne searched for the right words. "In my business, there's always pressure to be on, to be the Rock, 24/7. People expect it. They want the catchphrases, the attitude." Chuck considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The trick," he said finally, "is to never let the persona consume the person. Remember that the Rock is something you do, not someone you are." He leaned forward slightly. "Keep a space that's just yours, people who know you as Dwayne, not as the Rock. Protect that space, nurture it. Because when the lights fade and the crowds go home, that's who you'll be left with." Dwayne finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Chuck nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. "Exactly." Outside, the first birds had begun their morning songs, a tentative chorus growing as night reluctantly gave way to day. Through the windows, the sky had lightened to a pale blue, stars fading one by one. Slim, the last of the regulars, stumbled toward the door, throwing a loose salute in their direction. "My two favorite tough guys," he called, his voice slurred but affectionate. "Making peace. That's beautiful, man." As the door swung shut behind him, Chuck checked his watch. "I should get going," he said. "Got ranch work waiting." They rose together, the moment heavy with the significance of what had transpired between them over the course of the night. Not just a confrontation avoided, but something more valuable forged in its place, a connection neither had anticipated. "I appreciate the conversation," Dwayne said, extending his hand. "And the lesson." Chuck clasped his hand firmly. "The best lessons are the ones we don't know we're learning until they're already taught." He held Dwayne's gaze for a moment longer. "You've got potential beyond the ring, Johnson. Beyond the catchphrases. Don't lose sight of that when the crowd is chanting your name." The words settled into Dwayne's consciousness. A weight and a gift. "I won't," he promised, and was surprised to realize he meant it. As they walked toward the exit, Rosie called out from behind the bar. "Mr. Norris, don't forget to leave your number if you want the kid to reach you." Chuck paused, considering this, then nodded. He borrowed a pen from Rosie and jotted something on a napkin, which he handed to Dwayne. "My ranch," he said. "About 30 minutes west of here. If you're still in town tomorrow and want to continue this conversation, come by around noon." Dwayne looked down at the simple directions scrawled on the napkin, understanding the significance of the invitation. "I'd like that," he said. Outside, the Texas morning greeted them with cool, fresh air and the promise of another scorching day to come. The parking lot was quiet, dew glistening on the hoods of the few remaining vehicles. They walked in companionable silence to their respective cars. Before they parted, Chuck turned to Dwayne once more. "One last thing," he said, his expression thoughtful. "The strongest person in a room isn't the one who can lift the most or shout the loudest. It's the one who has nothing to prove." With those words hanging in the dawn air, Chuck nodded a final goodbye and climbed into his truck. Dwayne watched as he pulled away, the vehicle disappearing down the highway, until only a dust trail remained. Alone in the parking lot, Dwayne Johnson stood in the growing light, the napkin with Chuck's address clutched in his hand. He felt oddly lighter, as if something he'd been carrying, something he hadn't even recognized as a burden, had been set down. His reflection caught his eye in the window of his rental car, the same face, the same build that had entered the bar hours earlier, yet somehow fundamentally changed. He slid into the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, sitting in stillness, replaying the night's events in his mind. The grandstanding entrance. The beer bottle. The quiet authority in Chuck's eyes that had cut through his bravado like a hot knife through butter. The unexpected conversation that had followed. In the ring, transformation was scripted. The hero's journey mapped out, beat by beat. The character arc predetermined for maximum audience impact. But what had happened tonight was authentic evolution. Messy and unplanned, yet more meaningful for its spontaneity. As he finally turned the key and pulled out of the parking lot, Dwayne, not The Rock, he corrected himself, felt a curious sense of anticipation. The pressure to perform, to be on at all times, had momentarily lifted. In its place was something rarer and more valuable. The sense of having been truly seen, not as an icon or a character, but as a man still in the process of becoming. The Texas road stretched before him, empty in the early morning light. Behind him, the neon sign of the Lone Star Honky Tonk flickered once, then went dark as Rosie closed up for the night. The bar's role in this unexpected story complete, but not forgotten. Dwayne drove toward the rising sun, his mind already turning to the ranch visit ahead. He knew with certainty that he would be there at noon. Eager to continue learning from a man who had shown him a different kind of strength, one not measured in championships or catchphrases, but in the quiet dignity of knowing exactly who you are. In the years that would follow, as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson rose from wrestling star to global icon, from ring champion to box office phenomenon, he would return to this moment again and again in his mind. When the pressures of fame became overwhelming, when the line between persona and person grew dangerously thin, he would remember a Texas honky-tonk, a beer bottle, and the quiet strength of a legend who had taught him that sometimes the most powerful statement is silence. And in his own way, in his own time, he would learn to embody that lesson, to be not just The Rock, the electrifying entertainer, but Dwayne Johnson, the man who had discovered that true respect couldn't be demanded with catchphrases or physical dominance. It could only be earned through humility, authenticity, and the courage to be real in a world that often rewarded the artificial. That was the true legacy of his night with Chuck Norris. Not a story of conflict or competition between icons, but a moment of transformation when a young star glimpsed the path to becoming not just famous, but truly respected. Not just seen, but known. And, in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.